documents, the church orders, which is a set of documents that is a lot of things like apostolic constitutions, the Didache. We talked about that in detail. And then after that, we had a chance to read from Justin Martyr, right? And we talked about what liturgy looked like in the 2nd century and sort of his understanding of the Eucharist and how it was practiced in the church back then. And then, if you remember, we talked about the major shift in the way that the church practiced liturgy with the legalization of Christianity that propelled it from being the type of worship that was in like small home churches into now something that was sort of a larger ceremonial rite for liturgy that becomes sort of known and practiced in the 4th century. And then finally last week, I think we talked more about the liturgy of St. Cyril, which we'll continue a little bit today, which is among the 3 anaphoras that are known to the Coptic Church. And even though it's the one that we probably pray the least, it was actually sort of the oldest liturgy in the Coptic Church. And by tradition, the liturgy of St. Cyril is actually just a Coptic translation of what is known as the liturgy of St. Mark. Okay, so it's a very ancient liturgy. And the earliest structure of it was more basic, but over time was enriched. And for those of you who weren't here last week, sort of might be good to sort of go back and review the lecture from last week. But we talked about how that structure was enriched and how that relates to the offertory, specifically where the offertory used to be, how it was sort of the preparation, or prothesis, right, is the other name for it, and it was after the kiss of peace, before the anaphora, but then it got moved to the very beginning of the liturgy, and we saw some of the ripple effect of those changes, okay? And so for our part, I think last week we sort of ended at the offertory, but today we want to take a look now at the liturgy of the Word and liturgy of the faithful, as expressed not just in the liturgy of St. Cyril, but also in the other liturgies and some of the key differences. And then finally, we'll finish off talking about the evolution through the medieval period up until contemporary times. And this is sort of what we talked about again last week, about how the prothesis, which is a name that we don't oftentimes use, but it's actually, this is a snapshot from Coptic readers. So we call it prothesis, we just don't think of it like that. But the prothesis is the preparation prayer for that offertory, for the receiving of the gifts and blessing of the gifts. And then the sort of liturgy proper begins with the prayer of thanksgiving. That's what we talked about a little bit last week. One thing I want to mention before we get into the sort of topic of today is that, everything that we've covered so far is really just an introduction, okay? It's an overview. And there are obviously deeper ways to look at the liturgy that we're not going to be able to get into, But we've been looking at broad trends in liturgical sort of practice over hundreds of years. But there are people that study these things in detail, right? And they go through with a fine lens to compare and contrast how each liturgy was prayed within each time period and within each region, right? Because there are regional differences. And even if you have 2 liturgies that are contemporary to each other, okay, that are at the same time period, they may be prayed in a different way according to where they're practiced. Okay, and so seeing that evolution gives us insight into the ritual practice of those times, and ultimately informs how we practice in our times. Okay, for example, we see things in the liturgy that we see today maybe that don't always make sense to us, but if we sort of understand it more fully with how it developed historically, then that helps us to really connect to the liturgy in a better way. Another way, not just looking at sort of the liturgy over time and the liturgy in different places, but even if you understand sort of the language that the liturgy was written in and how it was translated, because sometimes there are words that are translated into our language that don't fully capture the original meaning. So taking a closer look at the original meaning, the original intent of those words is also helpful to give you some depth in your understanding of the liturgy. And then the last thing I'll say is another way that you can go deeper into this, which we haven't done in this class, but is to look at the symbolism, okay? Symbolism of the different events in the liturgy and sort of the deeper theological meaning of those rites and what those words do impart to the believer. So all these are ways that give us understanding, and with it comes an appreciation for the liturgy, okay? And a deeper comprehension of sort of the concepts and the message of the liturgy. There are examples of this. We won't have time to go into it, but just recognize that there's sort of a deeper layer than what we're doing. And so I'm mentioning it because I know a lot of what we talked about in this sort of unit is about like dates and time periods and manuscripts and things like that, things that may not seem relevant But my hope is that for any of these things, it will inform how you practice liturgy today, how you approach liturgy today, how you benefit from the liturgy today, and how you share that appreciation of the liturgy with others, okay? Whether that's those whom you serve or whether that's sort of loved ones at home, they will look to you as a role model, okay? In how you understand the liturgy, and that deep appreciation for the liturgy can be infectious, right? We talked about this at the beginning, but you look at Pope Kyrillos, okay, who is sort of the patron saint for this class. He experienced the liturgy in such a way that it revived the liturgical life in the entire church, okay, just because of how much he understood and understood the depth of the liturgy. So it's incumbent on you to sort of make that effort to really learn more about your liturgy and live that liturgical life, because it's the basic foundation for everything that we do. So let's pick up where we left last week, which is the Liturgy of the Word. And we finished with the Thanksgiving prayer last week. We finished with the absolution of the ministers, and the next step being what we know as the Liturgy of the Word. Now the structure for the Liturgy of the Word is sort of quite simple. And we have this tradition, at least in northern Egypt, that there are 3 biblical readings followed by the gospel. Okay, so you would have the Pauline, the Catholic, the Acts, and then you'd have the Psalm and gospel together. And what's interesting is that actually, if you look at southern Egypt or upper Egypt, that wasn't necessarily the case. So if you look at manuscripts from like Saint Shenouda's monastery, or what's also known as the White Monastery, they document that outside of major feasts like the resurrection or nativity or the feast of a specific major saint, it was typically just one epistle and one gospel reading. Okay? And that epistle could have been from St. Paul, it could have been one of the Catholic epistles, it could have been a reading from the book of Acts, but not necessarily all 3. And over time, these sort of traditions merge, and you get the practice of reading all 3. In fact, the earliest account that we have of the 3 readings actually comes from the life of St. Hilaria, which I'm showing her icon up here. And it's a manuscript that's from the 9th century, talking about a saint, St. Hilaria, who lived in the 6th century, so a couple of centuries before. And she was the daughter of an emperor, Emperor Zeno, for what it's worth, and she was trying to get to Scetis, or the wilderness of Shehit, and wants to become an ascetic, right? So the story says that she goes to the Church of St. Mark on the Feast of St. Mark, and then she heard certain verses from the Pauline, she heard certain verses from the Catholic, and she heard certain verses from the Acts, the book of Acts, which really sort of gave her instruction, and it's outlined. It's kind of like what we think of, with the story of St. Anthony, where it says like, oh, he went to the church and he heard the gospel saying, sell all that you have. It's that same type of idea. But the fact that these 3 readings are mentioned suggests that it was already in practice by that time. The disclaimer, of course, is that, technically in the story, it's also describing the feast of a major saint, which we just said. We know that the feast of major saints would have had 3 readings in southern Egyptian practice. But for what it's worth, that's sort of the earliest account that we see, at least in the southern Egypt or upper Egypt literature, of having the 3 readings. Then you have the Synaxarium. The Synaxarium is read, which is, the word Synaxarium is a Greek word, which means sort of bringing together, like compiling together. So it's a compilation of the stories of the saints in a genre that's commonly known as hagiography. The question often comes as to when did the Synaxarium actually come about, and is believed to be from the 13th century, okay, a 13th century writing. And it comes mainly out of northern Egypt, okay, what we call sort of the Bahiric, because if you know Coptic dialects, there's Bahiric and there's Sahidic. So Bahiric usually refers to Upper Egypt, and Bahiric refers to northern Egypt, and Sahidic refers to southern Egypt, also known as Upper Egypt. There is evidence that there was once a separate Synaxarium for Upper Egypt, okay, with their own sort of saints, but we only have fragments of that. But the northern one sort of takes precedence as the official Synaxarium of the church. Now I say Bahiric and Sahidic as if it was actually once written in Coptic, but the fact of the matter is, being a 13th century work, it was only written in Arabic. It was actually never compiled in Arabic, in Coptic. There's a bishop who is believed to be the one who compiled it initially, which is Butrus Sawiros Jamil. He's believed to be the one that compiled it. Of course, it's been updated many times since then with new saints. One thing I'll mention about the readings which we'll probably go into further in detail maybe in another unit on liturgy, sort of the next time around, is that the readings of the day, like the lectionary, are for the most part linked to the saint of that day. Okay, Sundays and like Lent and Resurrection, the Holy 50 for Resurrection, that has its own system of lectionary. But outside of that, any other day of the year, typically like weekdays or sort of these non-fasting days, are typically linked to the saint of that day. And it's something that sort of has always been the case, like from the very beginning, that you would have the readings of the day that were always associated with the saint of that day. Okay. Now, over time, each of these epistles, Pauline, Catholic, Acts, they become associated with their own prayers, and it accompanies sort of a circuit of incense that follows. We're not going to be able to spend too much time on it today, but again, a deeper dive on sort of the next unit, because this is more about like history of the liturgy. The next unit, where we get into sort of the symbolic meanings, we'll get into those specific pieces. Now, if you remember from the biblical studies unit, we talked about how there was sort of two systems of exegesis or interpretation. Okay, there was this like Alexandrian form of biblical study, which was more allegorical, and then there was an Antiochian form of biblical study, which was more literal. Okay, and I bring it up here only because in the same way, there's actually also sort of a Alexandrian shape of the liturgy or format of the liturgy, and an Antiochian shape or general form for the liturgy. And in this case, it's not based, again, on theology as much as it is the structure. Like, what are the units of the anaphora as they develop? So, for example, many of us, if we pray the liturgy of St. Cyril, okay? We prayed the liturgy of St. Cyril just on Friday, and it's like disorienting in a way. Like, everything's all over the place. Things are on the, like, different sort of order than what you're used to. Like, the commemoration of the saints is like towards the beginning of the liturgy, you know, of the anaphora. And some of the litanies and prayers for like the peace of the church and the patriarch are also in the beginning, right after the kiss of peace. So things don't sit in the same place that we'd expect them to from the liturgy of St. Basil. But as it turns out, the structure for the liturgy of St. Cyril with this certain order is common amongst other anaphoras from that time period that give it this categorization of the Alexandrian sort of form of the liturgy, okay? Alexandrian type anaphora, which is St. Cyril. Ironically, the liturgy of St. Basil is, structurally speaking, Antiochian style, even though that's the one that we're most familiar with. Now, I'm not saying that the liturgy itself is from Antioch. It's not that it's not a product of the Church of Egypt. But just within that sort of categorization schema, it sort of aligns more with other liturgies that come from the Alexandrian style versus St. Basil comes from the Antiochian style. Now, if you look at one of the earliest copies that we have for this liturgy of St. Cyril or St. Mark, it comes from the prayer of Serapion of Thamuis. Okay? He was a bishop who lived in the Delta, and he was a close friend of Athanasius, who was contemporary at that time, sort of fourth century. This manuscript of all his prayers sort of includes a lot of prayers for different contexts, things like baptism and Eucharist, funerals, ordinations, etc. But the very first chapter of that manuscript includes one of the oldest copies that we have of the St. Cyril or St. Mark's anaphora. And so we'll use that as our basic foundation here to describe the structure of the anaphora. Okay. Remember last week, everything that we talked about, I would consider as pre-anaphora. Okay. Anaphora is when they start, the Lord be with you and with your spirit, lift up your hearts. We had them when the Lord, that's sort of the anaphora proper. That's when it begins. Everything prior to that, whether it's the offertory or the liturgy of the word or the kiss of peace, all those things are sort of pre-anaphora. So now we want to shift to the meat of the anaphora itself. And when you look at it, the way that it starts, sorry, it's smaller than anticipated, but it starts with a sort of a preface of thanksgiving, okay? Praising God for his creation, and it uses the term of sort of transitioning to a reasonable and bloodless service, okay? And that's sort of the beginning of how that anaphora begins. After that, you see just a long list of litanies, okay? A lot of different litanies, which actually includes the commemoration of the saints. We don't think of the commemoration of the saints as one of the litanies. Like, we think of litanies as like, oh, the peace of the church, or the patriarch, or the salvation of the world. But commemoration of the saints is within that sort of system, or within that section of litanies. And for the liturgy of St. Basil, that doesn't come till later, but for the Alexandrian shape of the liturgy, it actually comes usually in the other liturgies in this same family, will all come at the beginning, okay? And again, this is part of what's disorienting, is because all of a sudden you go straight into these litanies that you're not used to. And it's also a lot of litanies, okay? 16 or 17 litanies that come with it. So you have the litanies. Then after that, it moves into the Sanctus, again, which is not a term that we oftentimes use in sort of Orthodox worship, but remember I mentioned to you comes from Isaiah chapter 6 of holy, 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 heaven and earth are full of your glory and honor. And then the priest begins the prayer of Agios, 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 okay? At the end of that prayer comes almost sort of like a mini epiclesis. You guys remember epiclesis was the term that we used for calling down the Holy Spirit to transform the body and blood. So this is almost like a mini epiclesis where the word that it uses is saying is asking God to fill this, your sacrifice, with blessing, okay? And what's nice about it is that idea of like fill this sort of thematically aligns with what we just said in the Sanctus, which was that heaven and earth are full of your glory. Fill us now and fill this sacrifice also with blessing. So that's something that we don't always appreciate, usually because we're too caught up in trying to understand where we are and what's in the liturgy. But these themes sort of align together. After that Sanctus, after the sort of epiclesis, then we have the institution narrative, which we've talked about extensively before, so I won't focus on it here. But the institution narrative pretty much aligns exactly with the St. Basil liturgy. It's almost exactly the same. And then the anamnesis, which is sort of the remembering, do this in remembrance of me. So those things go together, same as they would in St. Basil's liturgy. And then you have the second epiclesis prayer, which is, I guess I would say more explicit, in that it's asking the Holy Spirit to transform the bread and the wine. And then this leads to the final sort of doxology, which is, as it was, so shall it be from generation to generation. That's like the conclusion of the anaphora prayer. A lot of people ask about what that means, as it was, so shall it be. It has a complicated history, but long story short is it's probably better understood if you said, as he was, so shall he be, he is from generation to generation. It's just a translation of the way it comes from the Greek. It's not so much it, but about God, or about the Trinity, really. So you could use it, but it's about the Trinity, saying that, and it's also both in the liturgy of St. Cyril and in the liturgy of St. Basil, it comes like almost, it used to be switched around with the part after it. So it makes more sense if you were to put it after the guide us throughout the way into your kingdom, that part. If you put it at the end of that, you'll see it ends with like the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And then you respond, as he was, so shall he be, he is from generation. So that's like the glorification that ends this part of the liturgy. Does that make sense? And so that structure of the liturgy that we pray in the liturgy of St. Cyril to this day is found in the prayers of the Bishop of Thamois, which is Sarabion, all the way back to the 4th century, which is very early. And I think that's very cool that we have an early text that's still in practice today. So that's really amazing. Now, if you look at the liturgy of St. Basil, ironically, as I mentioned, even though it's sort of the most commonly one prayed in the liturgy in the Coptic Church today, it follows a different structure, which in its basis is more in Antiochian in style. Okay. And if we look at the structure of this, we don't have to spend as much time on it, but it should look familiar to you because we do this every Sunday. It still begins with the same type of praising of God and thanking him. So you are the God of truth, you reign before the ages, you dwell in the highest, you look upon the lowly, and it goes on to recount like the story of salvation, okay? That, you formed us and you created us and you placed us in the paradise of joy and we disobeyed your commandments, but you didn't abandon us, you sent your son. So that's like the first section is this, again, praise and thanksgiving and recounting what God has done for us. So that's that first section, which in many ways is the same as how you start with St. Cyril. Different words, but same idea and same sort of process. This is then followed by the institution narrative, which again we've talked about before, so I won't rehash it here. But again, in the Antiochene structure, it comes right here, right after that, like the Thanksgiving, so it sort of comes at the beginning. Sorry, I skipped over the Sanctus. We say the Sanctus in between those two things. So it's similar, that part is similar to St. Cyril's liturgy, where you have Sanctus before the institution narrative. Same with St. Basil, Sanctus before the institution narrative. Then we have the anamnesis, this idea of doing this in remembrance of me. And then the epiclesis that we're familiar with, where we're calling upon the Holy Spirit to sanctify these gifts and transform them into the body and blood of Christ. And then at the end of all that that's when we have the intercessions, the prayers for the church and the patriarch and the priests and the commemoration as well. And sort of that's how that first section ends. And then that final doxology, as it was, or as he was, so shall he be, he is from generation. So again, that sort of follows the same. So, if you pray the liturgy of St. Cyril, don't get too caught up and get confused by it, because, they prayed it on Friday, and people afterwards, felt like not as excited about it because because it's not something that we're used to, it's not familiar. But it's still very nice liturgy, and it's something that we can sort of benefit from. It's classically prayed in times of Lent, is what I've seen. I think that sort of tradition bears out. St. Basil typically is prayed. So St. Cyril is typically prayed during Lenten times. St. Gregory is typically prayed during feasts, and St. Basil is sort of the standard or default for all the other ones. Let me see if I want to say something else about this. The only other thing that I didn't write up here, so I write it as if we end at that final doxology, as it was, so shall it be. And that technically is an end before we get to the second major part of the liturgy, which is the fraction, or the introduction to the fraction. Again, let us give thanks to God the Father. So that part, the fraction, is like a second part. If you notice, both that part and the actual anaphora proper both begin with giving thanks. Right? At the beginning, when we say, the Lord be with you, with your spirit, let us give thanks to the Lord. So same thing happens here. So again, let us give thanks to the Lord. Okay. And that gives way to the confession, the communion, and the distribution. Okay. Now, one thing I wanted to say about St. Basil is actually there are several liturgies that are attributed to St. Basil across the different liturgical traditions. It's not just in the Coptic Church. This sort of is a framework for it, that there's multiple liturgies. It's a family tree, I guess, of all the liturgies that bear the name of St. Basil. There's Egyptian Basil, which is the oldest, or believed to be the oldest of these different Basil liturgies. But there's also like another anaphora of St. Basil in the Armenian Church, which is somewhat related, but not exactly the same. And then there are anaphoras for St. Basil, which are Syriac Basil and the Byzantine Basil. Sorry, it's cut off here. And this sort of family tree is just trying to outline, scholars in this work have tried to see, okay, well, these look like related, but some parts are different, so maybe there's another version of St. Basil that we don't know about, that, maybe this is sort of the genealogy of these. It's not that important, but it's just interesting to see. We know that St. Basil was a bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia, okay? So how does his name become associated with the liturgy, the Egyptian liturgy of St. Basil, okay? His only known visit to Egypt was in the 350s, where he spent some time in Alexandria, and he also spent some time looking at some of the Coptic monasteries in Lower Egypt, so northern Egypt. But when he came to visit Egypt, he was a layman. So it's not like he was exactly authoring anaphoras at that time. So it's unclear how that would have happened, but the theory is that, he sort of forged links with, the monks and laymen at the time, and as he grew in prestige and as he became sort of ordained to the bishopric, you can imagine that he would have had an influence. And there are also accounts of ascetics from Egypt going to visit him. So the thought is that, they would have brought this liturgy back with them to Egypt. Whatever the case is, it's clear that this liturgy becomes established quite early on in Egypt, right? So St. Cyril was sort of first, St. Basil was closely behind. For St. Gregory, there's not as much sort of material on St. Gregory, mostly. It's hard to find a lot about it, so we're not going to be able to spend too much time in. Also, we have a couple other things that we want to cover today. But we'll leave St. Gregory off for now. The only thing to know about St. Gregory, again, that is prayed on feasts, and the only difference is how it's addressed. If you notice, a lot of it is in the sort of second person. You died for me, you did this, you placed me in the paradise of joy, as opposed to he, third person. So it's more of a you-I type of relationship. And it's addressed to the Son, the second person of the Holy Trinity, as opposed to the other two, which are addressed to the Father. So as we begin to make our way into medieval times with these three anaphoras, we begin to see a few key changes, okay? The first is that you begin to see the emergence of two parallel traditions or systems of worship, even within Egypt, all right? So I'm not going to talk about anywhere else, but just looking within Egypt, you see these two parallel traditions. Obviously, there are regional differences that we talked about before, whether they're from like Alexandria or Cairo, like northern Egypt versus sort of upper Egypt. But even beyond that, there begins a system of worship that is specific to urban centers, okay, which is sort of what we know as the cathedral rite. And there is another system of worship that's specific to the monastic communities known as the monastic rite. The cathedral rite, if you had to sort of characterize it, it's a lot of what we've already talked about so far. Okay, it has sort of a more ceremonial aspect to it. There's processions, there's candles, there's incense. You have the clergy, specifically like the bishop, who plays sort of a central role in presiding over the services. The services themselves tend to be characterized more by chants that people participate in, and they chant antiphonically, like back and forth. And of course, there's a focus on teaching and scripture reading, and the prayers are a bit sort of shorter because they need to be more accessible to people, right? Because this is sort of catering to the people. And then the last thing I'll say about it is that the office of the cathedral rite is typically carried out at limited times. So you just have like matins and vespers, like two sort of morning and evening, okay? You contrast that now with the monastic rite, okay? That was really championed in Sketis, Sketis. In Arabic, we say that as shahit, or also Wadi Natrun. If anybody's been to the monasteries in Wadi Natrun, that's all the same thing. The same Bishoy, Suryan, Baramus. These are all in that same area. But the rite of the monastic community is characterized by almost near continuous prayer, ascetic disciplines, personal holiness. Okay, the services tend to be longer. They're more focused on like private reading and silence and contemplation. The Agbeya, okay, also another word you might see for it is the Horologion, okay, which is just a book of hours, Horologion, or the Agbeya, is sort of the main product of that tradition, okay? So when you think of monastic rite, think of the Agbeya. When you think of the sort of cathedral rite, think about the other sort of, matins, raising of incense, or vespers, raising of incense. What's interesting is that you'll actually see a lot of similarities between these two parallel traditions, okay? And I put just an example of one, which if you look at, this would be the outline for like let's say the first hour of the Igbeya, and then sort of the matins, matins prayer in the morning, okay? If you look at it, the Agbeya usually begins with a thanksgiving prayer. So does Matins, Rafal Bukhur, okay? That starts with a thanksgiving prayer. The Agbeya, also, after the thanksgiving prayer, you have Psalm 50, okay? And the Matins raising of incense, you might say, no, we don't say Psalm 50 and Matins of raising of incense. But if you think to some of the other occasions, like funeral prayer, or like the La'an, or even some of the like Bright Saturday or other raising of incense type settings, you sing the verses of the symbols, but then what do you do right after that? You do Psalm 50, okay? And if you remember that idea that we talked about earlier, one of sort of Baumstark's laws, so to speak, was that the more solemn periods tend to preserve what used to be the norm throughout the year. So when you look at something like that, you say, okay, so Psalm 50 is chanted at Bright Saturday is a good example of that. So you have Thanksgiving prayer, you have Psalm 50. The Agbeya then gets into the Psalms, followed by the Gospel. And the Matins of raising of incense has after this, they have the doxology, right? And then they also have a Psalm and Gospel. So there's some similarities there. We'll come back to that in a second. The Agbeya then has the morning doxology. Let us praise the angels, saying, glory to God in the highest, peace on earth, goodwill toward men. So that morning doxology, we say it in the Agbeya. We also say it in Matins raising of incense, right? Right before we do the doxologies, we do that, let us praise the angels. After that, in the Agbeya, we say the Trisagion, right? Holy God, holy mighty, holy immortal. We say the same thing in the Matins raising of incense, okay? Both of them have Hail to you, O Saint full of glory. Both of them have the introduction to the creed. Both of them then have the actual creed. Both of them have a psalm, right? Psalms followed by a gospel, or in the Matins raising of incense, it's just one psalm and then the gospel. So, you know, they're sort of two very parallel traditions. And then, of course, litanies, right? The litanies of the Agbeya, similar to like the litanies that we do after the gospel. Oftentimes they get skipped, you know, because we say them silently, but there's litanies there. So you have these two parallel and yet clearly not independent rites develop. Over time, particularly in the maybe 6th to 8th centuries, the monastic rite begins to influence sort of the cathedral worship, because monasticism becomes this sort of central spiritual force in Egyptian Christianity. Many bishops were chosen from among the monks, okay? And so they bring that monastic spirituality into sort of urban worship. And so you see the Agbeya now becomes part of sort of the liturgical life of like the parish, okay? And so what you see today in sort of the Coptic liturgical life that we have now is really a fusion of the two, okay? Now we have the formal structure of the cathedral rite, and it's combined with sort of that deep spirituality of the monastic tradition like the Agbeya, okay? And this, you know, actually can lead to a duplication, as you can see, of some of the prayers, right? We say all these different things that we say twice. You know, when you have a typical, let's say, Vespers, Asheya, okay? Vespers usually just starts straight with Asheya, but typically in the rite of the church, it begins with Vespers prayers, that's the Agbeya, followed by Vespers praises, right? That's the Tazbehat Asheya, and then we have the actual Vespers raising of incense. So in that long course of different prayers, a lot of those things gets duplicated, and it's in part because of this fusion of these two separate traditions, okay? And the only other thing I'll mention about it is, so Vespers was one concept, or was one place where we see that. But even, you know, we spent a lot of time last week talking about the offertory, right? And sort of the changes that happen to the offertory. One of the things that we didn't spend any time on is the fact that, if you remember, we do the Agbeya at the beginning of the offertory, right? We do the Agbeya, we have like all these prayers, the 3rd and 6th hour, and even the chanting of the 41 Kyrie eleison, or 41 Lord have mercies, we fuse that with the offertory prayer. So while they're doing the selection of the Orban, we're essentially saying the Kyrie eleisons that belonged to the Agbeya. So we're just finishing off the Agbeya part of the prayer while we're doing the offertory. And that's why in certain feasts where we don't pray the Agbeya, we don't do Kyrie eleison. So whether that's like Great Thursday, which is coming up, we don't do Kyrie eleison because we don't pray the Agbeya during Vescha week. Or the resurrection, we don't do the Agbeya because on that feast of the resurrection, we're not praying the hours of the Agbeya. So again, just sort of trying to give you some sense of where these different prayers come from, where these different rites and traditions sort of come from, and how sort of that fusion happens, which happens specifically during medieval times. Another major transition that you see in medieval times is a shift in language. I'll spend a few minutes talking about this as well. Now, as you sort of probably originally appreciated, that the language of the church, the language of Christians in Alexandria was dominated by Greek, okay? And you can blame that on Alexander the Great. He was the one that sort of brought Greek to Egypt and to other places through this process of Hellenization that we talked about before. But Greek sort of became that lingua franca. It's like the language that bridges people who didn't always speak the same language, okay? Kind of like English is today. Now, so Greek is the early language of the church. there is a narrative that says that after the Council of Chalcedon, that we as a Coptic church wanted to abandon Greek, right? And that sort of narrative is imbued with nationalist thoughts. We're rejecting Greek because it's the language of Byzantium and or Chalcedon, and we adopted Coptic right after that. And so you get this sort of dichotomy that Greek equals heretical and Coptic is sort of the Orthodox language. But if you look historically, the fact of the matter is that Greek actually persisted for a while after that, okay? We see examples of Greek loanwords in Coptic. We see that Greek remained sort of the theological, the language for official theological discourse for a long time. Even some of our Coptic popes up until the 7th or 8th century were actually culturally Greek. And Greek education was like the standard for most folks until the 9th century. It was a form of correspondence between Copts, like even from a Copt to another Copt. So it was sort of favored for a long time, and it wasn't, this story of being instantly abandoned in the face of Chalcedon. Liturgically, we see this because a lot of ancient chants and prayers remained in Greek, something that you still see today, right? The priest says Irini Pasi, that's Greek, it's not Coptic. The congregation responses are often in Greek. Agios is a Greek word, it's not a Coptic word. Agios, Kyrie eleison. Kyrie eleison is a Greek phrase for Lord have mercy. Amin, 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 ton, thana, ton. All those are Greek responses. Most of the deacons' responses are also in Greek, or say prosevixasti, those are all Greek words. And so Greek sort of remained very powerful in the church for a long time. Even after Greek wasn't used predominantly, we still see Greek in the liturgy to our present day. If you look at some of the manuscripts from the church of that time period, you'll even find ones that are Greek and Arabic, which I thought was really cool. So Greek and Arabic, not necessarily Coptic and Arabic like you might expect. One manuscript, which I have a picture of up here, is actually a Greek translation of the liturgy of St. Basil, which don't really have much, right? Our liturgy of St. Basil is always in Coptic, but this is a Greek translation of it, and then the Arabic next to it. So Arabic and Greek, and this is actually the prothesis prayer, the preparation prayer that we talked about that's in the offertory. There are also some, another cool thing I found was that there's some other Sahidic, remember Sahidic is that dialect of Upper Egypt, manuscripts that have Greek and Coptic, okay, but not in the way that you might think. The Greek are all the chants and prayers. And the places where there are Coptic are like the rubrics, like the instructions, like, oh, the priest stands here, the deacon stands there. Those parts are in Coptic, explaining what is otherwise sort of the Greek prayers, kind of like what we have today, where you have the prayers and the chants are in Coptic, and then we might have an explanation or a rubric in English or Arabic, okay? And these are manuscripts that are, up until like the 11th century. So that's sort of where Greek fits into that sort of medieval time period. So where does Coptic fit into all of it? The earliest, as I mentioned, the earliest Christians in Alexandria spoke Greek, but Coptic was still obviously the language of the people, language of sort of the forefathers. It was the more traditional language. Christianity hadn't made its way into the Coptic language, at least from a manuscript tradition, until about the 3rd or 4th century. That's when we begin to see biblical manuscripts in Coptic. And there are multiple Coptic dialects, as I mentioned. The Sahidic and the Baharic are the sort of main ones. Sahidic is sort of Upper Egypt, Baharic is Northern Egypt. Baharic is pretty much the predecessor of everything that we have today in terms of dialects of Coptic. But the Sahidic, which is sort of Upper Egypt, which we don't see as much of today, was the more classical sort of Coptic dialect that dominated Christian texts. If you look at people like Saint Shenouda the Archimandrite, some of his writings are among the best preserved writings in that Sahidic dialect. And the Baharic doesn't really become prominent until like the 8th or 9th century, which is ironic because that's sort of as Coptic was beginning to die out in the church. If you think about Arab conquest is in the 7th century, so Arabic becomes more prominent. Sahidic dies out as Baharic is taking over, but both of them are overall sort of dying out as the Arabic is taking over both of them. Okay, Now I'm talking about this just in terms of a manuscript tradition, so it's not like there wasn't Baharic before that or that there wasn't Coptic before that. It's more that the manuscripts that are preserved that we have, that's sort of the tradition, sort of the trend that you see. And then Arabic. You know, what's interesting about Arabic is that for the majority of the life of the church, the language of the people has been Arabic, okay? Longer than the time that it was Greek, longer than the time that it was Coptic, Arabic has played a fairly dominant role. One of the sort of first bishops who wrote in Arabic was the one that I have a picture of up here. His name is Sawirus of Ashmunin. And he was one of the first who wrote in Arabic, specifically having the ability to be comfortable expressing sort of Coptic Orthodox theological concepts in Arabic, okay? Because it was at that time that probably clergy were more comfortable delivering sermons in Coptic rather than in Arabic. Similar to, like, you know, if you had a priest that was coming from Egypt right now, they might be more comfortable delivering a sermon in Arabic than they would in English, you know, especially, you know, complicated sort of theological concepts. So it was the same idea at that time where Coptic was sort of more familiar, but he was among the first that began to do this in Arabic, okay? And, you know, his writings are in the 11th century. It's about 4 centuries after the Arab conquest, which is the 7th century. By about the 14th to 15th century, most Copts living in Egypt are speaking and writing in Arabic almost exclusively, okay? And so many of the patristic fathers that we have from that time period are beginning to pass down their writings and their teachings in Arabic, okay? Not to say that there wasn't resistance to that. It's not that, you know, because this concept of sort of the Arabization of that heritage wasn't welcomed. So this was one quote. Again, sorry, it's too small, but I'll read it to you. It says, this was from a manuscript called the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Samuel. He says, "Woe to every Christian who teaches his son the language of the Herja," which is the Arabic basically, "from his childhood and makes him forget the language of his ancestors." So very, very anti-Arabic and really wanted to keep the Coptic. But that was, again, these are the growing pains with any time a new language comes in. You know, you can see the same struggle like here in America when we came in with English. You know, well, people who are here, you know, who are older, maybe you remember, like most of our liturgies when we were kids, most of our sermons, everything was in Arabic. There was nothing in English, right? Wilhelmina can attest to this, you know, remembers this. But, so it's the same sort of process that happens in sort of every generation here, especially when there's a new language that's coming in. But I'm bringing it up here just because we want to recognize some of the contributions of Arabic to the development of the liturgy. We're oftentimes very quick to claim our Coptic heritage, but downplay the role of Arabic in the life of the church. But the fact of the matter is that Arabic, for better or for worse, has been the primary language of the church for over 1,100 years, which is longer than the Coptic and longer than the Greek. Not to say that to abandon the other ones, but just something to be aware of in terms of our heritage here, okay? For the last part, what I want to do, I know we're running late, so I'm sorry, but we want to just highlight some of the key figures who contributed to the contributed in different ways to the liturgical life of the church. And it's just helpful at least to hear who they were and what some of their contributions were. And then, of course, you can read up on them in more detail if you want, so you can become familiar with them. But it's sort of very interesting to see. The first one that I'll mention was Pope Christodulus. Okay, he was the Pope in the 11th century who laid out a system of canons to standardize the liturgical practice of his time and also sort of form a foundation for many centuries after that. So, for example, in his writings is the first time that we hear about this idea of a general funeral prayer after Palm Sunday. Okay, it's a brief reference. It's a brief reference, but it's there, and at least for our purposes, tells us that this was the norm of practice at that time. So when we start asking, like, when did we do this and why did we do it? You know, at this at least we know sort of when it was done, or at least when it became sort of standard in practice. So he mentioned that. Another thing that, you know, another claim to fame for him in terms of liturgical studies, he you know, has this episode that describes about this liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts. There's a tradition in other, or there's a practice in other traditions where the Eucharist that's left over from Sunday's liturgy can then be kept and prayed upon in a sort of like mini liturgy like days later, where they just do like maybe a matins or like a, you know, vespers or something, raising of incense, some brief prayers, and then they take communion a couple days later. Okay? And this is common in other traditions during Lent, where they would only pray the liturgy on Sunday. They wouldn't pray it during the week, but they would still partake of communion in this sort of mini liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts on like Wednesday or something like that. And so people would ask whether or not we ever had something like that in the Coptic Church. And in his biography of Pope Christodoulos, there's a story that he was visiting the monastery of St. Macarius during Holy Week one year, and to his surprise, he saw that there were monks that were in the habit of keeping the body from Palm Sunday and sharing it with each other on like Monday and on Tuesday. And so, you can read the story, it goes back and forth about, he actually had more concerns about like honestly, the health and safety. It was like the bread is rotting. Like you can't do this. It's not good. It's not safe. So he ultimately was able to convince them. It says that he found a manuscript in the library that proved that this is not the practice that should be done. Regardless of what it is, it's sort of a famous story about this idea, and it's possible it may have been in the church to some extent, but we don't sort of do that liturgy type anymore. Another prominent figure is Pope Gabriel II, Ibn Turik is his sort of nickname. His sort of claim to fame, honestly, is Arabization. Okay? In a number of places, Pope Gabriel sort of exhorts the clergy to pray in Arabic and to preach in Arabic. He would say things like the children need to know how to say Our Father in Arabic, and the children need to know how to say the Creed in Arabic so that they can understand what they believe. He's not the first person to say this, but his name is probably the most famous one that's tied to that movement. He also had canons related to sort of vestment regulations and what type of vestments should be worn by the clergy, by deacons, the duties of the different deacons, ranks of deacons. And he used to always talk about emphasizing the importance of knowledge. And I think that goes hand in hand with this push for Arabization. It's not so much that he promoted Arabic. What he's saying is that it's more important that he's promoting understanding, and that he wants the people to know what they're praying and understand what they're saying. And then maybe the most famous remark that he made comes and writes about the standardization of the three anaphoras. He says something to the effect like, hey, I've heard that there are some communities, some monastic communities that are praying anaphoras separate from the three that we know, and basically don't do that, or unless you want to bring that anaphora to us, bring it to the patriarchal office and we can sort of review it and decide. But it doesn't mean that he arbitrarily decided, this is the point where we need to have only three. He's just saying, I think he was just restating the tradition of that time, which is that there are three anaphoras that we know, and he's sort of affirming that. Another one is Pope Cyril. So I mentioned Pope Gabriel's on the left there. Pope Cyril Ibn Laklak is the name. I don't know what that means, but I know that his Synaxarium reading was actually just a couple of Sundays ago. His claim to fame is that he published sort of a set of canons that in many ways reorganized the church. Okay? He had 5 sort of main books. One was for like legislation and management of the patriarchate. One was for like endowments and pledges. One was for like rituals of the church. And so these canons become quite central to ecclesiastical life in the 13th century. Pope Gabriel V, he writes a famous book called Al-Tartib Al-Taqsi, which is the ritual order. And it tells about how at the time there's lots of variations in liturgical practice across Egypt, and this would cause conflicts amongst deacons and clergy and things like that. And so he set out to, he gathered sort of bishops and other individuals who were sort of knowledgeable about the rites to issue a sort of standardized book of rituals about how to perform the liturgy. What's interesting is that this book, we only have one copy of it. So you think, well, how important could it be? Well, if you look at all the other cholegis or euchologians moving forward, they all include in their rubrics the instructions from this book, almost verbatim, okay? Suggesting that it was actually quite influential in sort of the ritual order of the church. Last couple people I'll mention here. One is a guy named Abu Barakat Ibn Qabar, okay? Which you'll hear his name a lot if you sort of study rites. His full name is actually a mouthful. It's Shams Riyasa Abu Barakat Ibn Qabar. So he just goes by Ibn Qabar because that's much easier. He used to be a secretary of one of the Mamluk sultans who ruled over Egypt, but at a time when sort of Islamic oppression became sort of stronger, He ultimately left his post and he became a priest at what's known as the Hanging Church, al-Mu'allaqa. His most well-known work is called Misbah al-Zulma wa Ida al-Khidma. I think is how you pronounce it, but Lamp of Darkness is what we call it. And it's not a liturgical book in the sense that you could sit there and like pray a liturgy from it. It's more of a descriptive scholarly work that helps somebody learn how the services function and what goes on in the services, sort of if you're just looking from a distance. We never know at any point where he's actually getting his information from. He does try to show some regional awareness. We'll be like, oh, you know, in this area they used to pray like this, and in some parts of Egypt they say like this. But he was praying in Cairo, and so presumably what he's taking from is the tradition in Cairo at that time. Another big one that you might hear is Yohanna ibn Abi Zakaria ibn Sabah, or Sabah. Nobody actually knows how the name is pronounced because even the way that it's spelled in Arabic, it can go either way. So nobody fully understands. But he was in the 13th century, and his sort of big work that he published was, says, Al-Gawhar al-Nafisa fi ulum al-Kinisa. So it's nice, it rhymes. It means the precious jewel in ecclesiastical sciences. The theory is that he was an archdeacon that was closely tied to the Pope, and he writes contemporary to Ibn Qabr. So whenever people talk about like church practices and they're trying to understand where do we get this from, how is it, you know, they'll oftentimes reference these two guys because they write at the same time. And he gives sort of an extensive encyclopedia on sort of various aspects of theology and liturgy and ecclesiastical practice. He doesn't give as much technical details, but he seems to focus more on symbolic interpretations of, you know, the spiritual meaning behind the rites that he's describing. Okay, whereas Ibn Qabr is more describing, you know, is interested in describing how the service functions and what's said and things like that, rather than explaining any sort of like what it means. So that's sort of the difference between those two. I'll skip that one. We talked about him already. Another one is Raphael at-Tuhi. Okay, he was in the 18th century, so now we're jumping up a couple centuries. I promise this is just the one or two last ones. Okay. Even after all this time, you know, which is 300, 400 years later from the other authors that we just looked at, there's still a lot of regional practices. And that really continues until you start to get printed books. So now that we're starting to get into printed books, you begin to see a lot more standardization. So the top half are the earliest books that are printed in the 18th century. And what's interesting, Raphael al-Tuhi was born Coptic Orthodox, but he actually converted to Catholicism in his early days. And he went to Rome in the Vatican to study, and he was ordained there as a bishop. And he was actually supposed to have been assigned as the bishop of Asyut for the Catholic Church, even though there hadn't been yet established the Coptic Catholic Church in Egypt. But actually never happened. So he sort of, he never left Rome, he never came back to Egypt, but he stayed at the Vatican and became something of a Coptic scholar in the Vatican library. Like he was in charge of the Vatican library and in charge of teaching Coptic Catholic monks who lived there. And he was also in charge of sort of using liturgical books that were used by the Coptic Catholic Church, okay? And so he single-handedly produced all these books, which is actually really impressive. And all these are available online if you want to look at. What's interesting about it is that it's an episode in Coptic liturgy that they're used outside of Egypt, not intended for the Coptic Orthodox Church, but like it carries a lot of what we pray in the liturgy. They're different in key aspects. For instance, like anything in the euchologion or the psalmody that opposes sort of non-Chalcedonian doctrine will be changed in these. Okay, so for instance, the creed will have like the filioque, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And he has that both in Coptic and Arabic in the book. Or like in the commemoration, he'll get to like Pope Dioscorus or Severus, he'll jump right over them and go to, straight to Athanasius and Cyril and Peter. So it's interesting that it's a Coptic liturgy, but it's been changed a little bit to cater to that particular confession, but we still can learn a lot about it for our own. 1887 is sort of the first printed euchologion for Coptic Orthodox, but it's definitely overshadowed by probably the one that's the precursor for all liturgy that we have in our church today, which is the 1902 version from Abuna al-Masih al-Salib al-Baramusi. And that's probably the one that forms the basis for everything that's done. It's actually very well done, and it sort of has, you know, the tradition, the sort of the writings, but also incorporates and mentions other traditions that were prominent in other parts of Egypt. And so again, it's the standard issue of the Coptic Collegium. So that's sort of a whirlwind of liturgical history in a very, very abbreviated sense. You know, we spent a lot of time over the last few weeks, probably more detail in those early centuries, and could have spent equal amount of detail, if not more, in these later sort of ones. But I just wanted to get people a sense of how rich that heritage is and how rich that history is. We didn't even get into the spirituality of the liturgy, which I know maybe some of you were thinking that maybe that's what this unit was going to be. But I thought it would be helpful first to begin with that foundation of sort of the history and where it comes from and how we sort of received it. And with that knowledge, then we can then sort of graduate into figuring out like the spiritual meanings of the different things that happen, recognizing that not everything that happens in the liturgy necessarily has a spiritual meaning. Some of the things come because of historical context, which is why it's helpful to see this. But we'll be able to take a deeper dive the next time around in some of the spirituality of the liturgy and get into these other pieces, hopefully, that people benefit from. Okay. Questions? Abuna.
Are the slides being shared?
I can. Yeah, they're not, but yes, we can.
I feel like there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I know.
And it'd be really good, I think, everyone during the week to take maybe some of these slides and just kind of like follow up and read some of these things, go deeper in. I think it's a very healthy practice. I mean, a lot of the things Ihab is saying, I then will go back and chat GPT it, which is like my new best friend. Has a lot of stuff. And it's very interesting, it's very enlightening, it's very enriching. So keep this dialogue with yourself even alive.
What I found fascinating in all this is that there are a lot of people that study the liturgy. They're not Coptic Orthodox, they're not like, they have nothing to be vested in this for, but they write books about the Coptic liturgy specifically, about liturgical practice in general, but they'll, you know, experts in Coptic liturgy that have no Coptic background or anything. And, you know, I found that very interesting, and I felt like, you know, it's something that we should maybe aspire to, is to learn more about our liturgy and understand more about how it came to us and how we can benefit. I'll try and share some of the readings that I've come across that might be helpful for people to read and just get a sense. Each of these types of readings will focus on liturgy like in a specific time period. So it's not going to be easy to find something that's comprehensive that's going to give you from A to Z. But even if we can get certain time periods, I think you can still benefit from it. Okay. Next week is Palm Sunday, no class. Week after that is Resurrection, no class. Still need to figure out with Mark and Abuna about when our next class will be, if we're going to have one the week after Easter or not. I think it depends on if there's other events going on. So more to come on that, but we will announce it in the WhatsApp group. Okay? Very good.
Let's send a prayer, guys. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Make us, O Lord, worthy to pray thankfully, saying, Our Father who art in heaven.
Hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses. We forgive those who trespass against us, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.